Okay, William Jones is next on Witte.
It's the wrong ones. He comes later. We'll leave the bad news until last. There you go. To the casual observer of the international political scene in 1870, the close relations then existing between autocratic Russia and the American Republic might seem rather puzzling. On closer examination, however, one could detect amazing similarities between these two very disparate nations. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II liberated the serfs of Russia, affecting the status of 52 million peasants, 22 million of them serfs. 2 years later, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln, by the Emancipation Proclamation, liberated 4 million slaves in the United States. During that same Civil War, Tsar Alexander sent a Russian fleet to the United States as a signal to the British that were they to enter the war on the side of the Confederacy, so would Russia enter on the side of the Union. The secret orders contained by the Russian commander said, in the event of war, you are to fire upon the commerce of the enemy, that is, on the British. With the decree of 1861 liberating the serfs, Russia took the first faltering steps on the road to economic and political reform. First slide here. Can we get it, maybe the lights down a little bit, and so that people can see this? I don't know if it's better. Okay. Focus a little bit too, also. Yeah. From 1892, the prime architect of that development policy, seems to be disappearing here, was Sergei Yulievich Witte, who for 11 years until his dismissal in 1903 would serve as the Russian Minister of Finance. During these years, the Russian economy would experience a spurt in the rate of growth hitherto unknown in that country. An unusual figure, Witte was a member of the lower nobility, born in Tbilisi in present-day Georgia. In his earlier career, including a shorter stint as Minister of Ways and Communications, Witte had the opportunity of formulating railway policy, including the centerpiece of the Russian program, the Trans-Siberian Railway. When he became finance minister, he had the means of realizing that program. Next slide. Okay. Witte reformed the entire state of Russian finances, stabilizing the widely fluctuating ruble by pegging it to gold. He also converted high-interest rate domestic loans into low-interest rate loans taken out abroad. Although Russia would have to borrow heavily during the coming 10 years in order to finance this massive railroad construction, the annual debt service grew only slightly. Witte transformed the finance ministry into a regular chancellery of the realm with extensive intelligence networks in all the major political and financial capitals of the world. His aim was to transform Russia from a backward peasant country into a major industrial power. As he expressed it in his annual report to the Tsar in 1899, we must give the country such industrial perfection as has been reached by the United States of America. In realizing this goal, Witte had some extremely able assistance from renowned Russian chemist Dmitry Ivanovich Mendeleev, better known to all students of chemistry as the discoverer of the periodic table. Here we see one of the original attempts at the periodic table by Mendeleev with some of the elements already missing. Mendeleev discovered the lawfulness of the construction of the elements, but that didn't mean that he knew where all the elements were. He just knew approximately where they would be, and it was later on that they would be discovered. This is an early attempt at putting that together. Mendeleev had already been appointed by Witte's predecessor, director of the Bureau of Weights and Standards, from which post he introduced the metric system into Russia, thus bringing the Russian system up to international standards. In 1899, Mendeleev, on behalf of the Ministry of Finance, led a group of scientists through the Ural Mountains in Siberia to examine the mineral deposits available on the basis of which Russia could develop her own iron industry, a prerequisite for railroad building. Next slide. Mendeleev also helped develop the world's first icebreaker, shown here in the picture, the Ermak. Mendeleev and Witte were both followers of the economic theories of German-American economist Friedrich List, a strong proponent of a system of protective tariffs for industrially backward countries behind which they would be able to develop their own infant industries safe from the cheaper products from more developed countries. The free market theories of British intelligence agent Adam Smith, touted so loudly these days by the friends of Newt Gingrich's conservative revolution, were specifically developed by Smith in the late 1700s in order to bamboozle the young American Republic into remaining a mere producer of agricultural goods. Fortunately for us, Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, didn't fall for these tricks. In 1894, the Ministry of Finance also took charge of all commercial and technical schools in Russia, opening up over 100 new schools during the following decade. In 1891, Russia, under the Tsar Alexander III, the son of the Tsar Liberator who had been assassinated in 1881, had made important moves toward establishing new relations with Republican France, thus opening up the French capital markets for Russian loans. In 1894, this relationship would provide the basis for the important collaboration between Witte and French Foreign Minister Gabriel Hanotaux, which would represent perhaps the greatest single challenge to the British colonial empire during that century. The collaboration also provided Witte with access to the needed capital to begin his great railroad construction. Next slide. For Witte, the most important educational program was that provided by a flourishing industry. Here you see them laying track or beginning to clear the road for the railroad. With the first investment in industry, Witte said, the powerful stimulus of personal interest calls forth such curiosity and love of learning as to make an illiterate peasant into a railway builder, a bold and progressive organizer of industry, and a versatile financier. Next slide. The Trans-Siberian Railroad would become the longest railroad in the world and still remains so today. But it was only the most important part of an extensive Russian network built during this period, as viewed in the next overhead in this foreign ministry map from 1900. You see, especially, if you can see it clearly, it's not a very good map, but up in the western part of Russia, there is an extensive network of rails. As you come down into Siberia, there is only the one single line, which was the case for a long period of time. For Witte, as for Friedrich List, railroads were much more than a mere means of transportation. As Witte himself would later write, the railroad exerts a civilizing influence as a theoretical and practical school where it does not so much adjust itself to the local conditions, but rather where the local conditions adjust themselves to the needs of the railroad. The railroad is, as it were, a seed bed which produces a cultural flowering within the population. And even if it meets on its route an absolutely barbarous people, it will in short time raise them to the necessary level of culture. And for Russia, this was a crying necessity, as the level of culture for the broad masses of people was absolutely abysmal, as we see in this picture from the famine that hit the country in 1891. And the railroad was built. Looking over to the chart here, you can see how many miles of rail per year were laid between 1890 and 1900, roughly the period where Witte was in charge of the finance ministry. Prior to the previous decade, that is between 1879 and 1892, there had been built 5,466 miles of new rails or opened up in Russia. In contrast to that, between 1892 and 1901, there had been constructed 14,814 miles of new rail, nearly triple the amount previous, a more rapid rate of railroad construction than any other country known except the United States. But the Trans-Siberian was more than simply a quick means of travel through the vast Siberian spaces. It was what Linda LaRouche would characterize as the land bridge to Asia. Traveling between London and Shanghai during that period, as we can see on the map, London on the one extreme and Shanghai on the other. would take a traveler by ship 34 to 36 days at a cost of 450 rubles. When the Trans-Siberian was completed, the same traveler could arrive in Shanghai from London in 16 days at a cost of 200 rubles for the same ticket. The overland journey would be twice as fast and 2.5 times cheaper. And indeed, people did travel. There was a planned immigration of opening up land for people who didn't have it in the Siberian spaces. People took that opportunity. Nearly 160,000 per year traveled on that Trans-Siberia to a new home in Siberia. By 1902, there had come at least 900,000, almost 1 million people, to inhabit these Siberian spaces. Next slide. The construction of the railroad also led to a tremendous upswing in industrial production. Coal production as a whole more than doubled between 1892 and 1902. Here we see a picture from the Ludwig Nobel iron foundry in St. Petersburg. In pig iron, Russian output tripled. The production of cast iron and steel increased 2.5 times. The strategic shift created by this infrastructural development in relations with the Far East, and in particular with the two major powers there, China and Japan, were obvious to everybody, not least of all to the very nervous British, who, as a maritime power, had achieved a veritable monopoly over the China trade, in particular the very lucrative tea trade. Understanding the full strategic impact of the Trans-Siberian land bridge for the entire area, Witte proposed that the final leg of the Trans-Siberian, instead of following the Russian border, which is kind of the curvy line up at the top on this side of the map, which is a river which provides the frontier of Russia. Instead, he wanted to drive it all the way through Manchuria, which then was a part of the Chinese Empire. The idea was to bring China into the increasing flux of international trade and development, which the railroad would facilitate. In 1895, in collaboration with French Foreign Minister Gabriel Hanotaux, Witte had pulled together a coalition of Russia, Germany, and France, the Continental League, which prevented the Japanese from seizing the Liaotong Peninsula that we see here in the blue peninsula that is part of China, south of Manchuria, which they had won as a result of their victory over the Chinese. Because of the pressure from these three countries, the Japanese were prepared to renegotiate that treaty and refuse to take any land or annex any territory from China, but settled instead for an indemnity, a money indemnity. Witte and Hanotaux then set up with French capital a Russo-Chinese bank to provide China with a major loan with which they could pay off its war indemnity to Japan and thereby assuage ruffled Japanese feelings at the loss of the Liaotong Peninsula. Russia also signed a mutual defense treaty with China by which they would come to China's assistance if they were again attacked by Japan. On the basis of the Chinese goodwill thus engendered, Russia was allowed to lease the territory necessary to build the Trans-Siberian Railroad through Manchuria. Witte established a private company which would be responsible for building the railroad. The Russo-Chinese Bank would also finance French railroad construction elsewhere in China between Peking and French Indochina, traversing veritably the country with new rail lines. Regarding the second major Asian power, Japan, it was Witte's hope to actually engage them in a treaty by which both nations would profit from the commercial benefits flowing from this new rail access to European markets. To do this, Witte was even willing to sacrifice Russian commercial interest in Korea, which was also of interest to Japan, in deference to the Japanese in order to bring about this treaty. As Witte himself explained in a memo to the Tsar in 1903, foregoing to a certain degree Korea, we remove for a sufficiently long period the object of continual quarrels with Japan, and out of an enemy we transform her, if not into an ally, then into a neighbor who will strive to preserve good relations with us for fear of again losing the territories she acquired with such difficulty. But in order for Witte's Far Eastern policy to succeed, the situation in Europe had to remain stable. The first successful formation of what Witte called the Continental League had shown its capabilities in the measures that had prevented Japanese annexation of the Liaotung Peninsula. During the following years, Witte's primary goal would be to make that league a permanent fixture of the political landscape directed against the machinations of what he saw as the real enemy, Great Britain. Altogether, our statesmen must realize, Witte said, the necessity of a Central European bloc consisting of Russia, Germany, and France. That would be the bulwark of peace because nobody would be able to violate it, least of all the British. Continual vacillation by the Tsar, seen in this early picture when Victoria was still around, was the weak-kneed and pitiably self-conscious Nicholas II, seen here in the far picture, and then Edward, Victoria, and who the little guy is, I don't know, I guess the successor to the throne. As well as annexationist designs, the weakness of the Tsar and annexationist designs on the part of a court coterie surrounding the Tsar prevented this Russo-Japanese agreement from ever really getting off the ground. Instead, the Japanese fell into the trap set up for them by the conniving British monarch. In 1902, the Japanese had signed a mutual defense treaty with Japan. But Witte's Far East policy started to unravel long before the Japanese jumped into bed with Uncle Bertie. In 1897, Kaiser Wilhelm, also flirting with the carefully concocted approaches being put out to Germany at that time by Chamberlain, and pushing to a limit a rather ambiguous verbal agreement he thought he had had with Tsar Nicholas, the Kaiser sent his fleet to occupy the Chinese port of Kiaochao. To his horror, Witte saw that this step would be the beginning of the partition of China by the Western powers. He immediately appealed to the Kaiser to call off the operation so as not to provoke similar actions on the part of Russia, which even occasionally leased Kiaochao as a winter port for her Far Eastern fleet. The Kaiser replied coolly that Witte simply didn't understand the situation and all the reasons behind it, and he should basically keep out of other people's business. As a result of the Kaiser's thoughtless actions, the dominoes did start to fall. Russia, against Witte's strenuous objections, occupied Port Arthur on the Liaotung Peninsula. Great Britain occupied Weihai Wei, also on the Gulf of Liaotung. The French occupied Kangchao, further down. This blatant breach of China's sovereignty helped to foment Chinese xenophobia and to provoke in 1900 the anti-foreigner movement known as the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion led to the dispatching of troops from all Western nations to China to quell the riots. Russian troops then poured into Manchuria. As the rebellion died down, plans were made to withdraw these troops in accordance with agreements Russia had made with China. But the same court coterie interested in annexationist plans in the area convinced the Tsar that the troops had to stay. Because of his own objections to this policy, Witte was dismissed by the Tsar. With Russo-Chinese relations now strained almost to the breaking point, the Japanese, egged on by the British, felt that the time was ripe to rid the area of Russian presence entirely. The Japanese made a surprise attack on the Russian base at Port Arthur on February 8, 1904. The Japanese war would last for 11 months and end in a massive defeat for Russia, as well as Webster noted, the total destruction of the Russian fleet. This would be the first modern war, foreshadowing the conflagration that was to occur 10 years later on the European continent. It was an unexpectedly bloody confrontation. Russia was no longer the only country that could mobilize a million-man army. When Russia indicated that it was willing to seek a truce, Witte again was called from retirement to negotiate a treaty under the rather duplicitous mediation of British stooge Theodore Roosevelt. Returning from New Hampshire after having negotiated a rather successful treaty anyway with the Japanese, Witte was asked by the Tsar to first visit Kaiser Wilhelm. There, Witte was told in broad outline about the recently signed Björka agreement between the Kaiser and the Tsar. The Kaiser presenting it as a first step towards Witte's so heartily espoused Continental League. Thinking this was actually the case, Witte was overjoyed. The Kaiser himself describes the scene. The effect was like a thunderbolt. His eyes filled with tears and enthusiasm, and emotion so overwhelmed Witte that he couldn't speak. Finally, he cried, "God be praised, thank God, at last this infamous nightmare which weighs upon us disappears." Returning to St. Petersburg and seeing the actual text of the treaty, Witte's enthusiasm for it subsided considerably. What he thought had been an entente between Russia and Germany was in fact a mutual defense pact, which was heavily weighted on the side of Germany and in stark violation of the treaty Russia had signed with France 12 years before. At that point, it might have been the only game in town, the French having gone into the British trap. But Witte rejected it, hoping to change it in some way so as to have a greater likelihood of breaking the French out of their romance with the British. Witte even asked the Kaiser to encourage the Tsar to appoint him ambassador to France in order to use his own considerable influence in that country to bring the French into the Continental League. Whether that would have succeeded or not is difficult to say, as 1 year later, less than 1 year later, the Tsar would appoint the Anglophile Izvolsky as the foreign minister. Next slide. I'll make it. All the grievances against the autocratic regime were released in the wake of this humiliating defeat. Here we have a typical picture of a workers' canteen in St. Petersburg. The humiliating defeat, which led to a revolutionary ferment throughout the country and a major polarization in which Witte's opponents, both on the right and the left, attempted to destroy his accomplishments. On the right, we have his perennial nemesis, Konstantin Petrovich Pobyednostsev. Pobyednostsev was the Ober-Procurator of the Holy Synod, the protector of the Orthodox faith, and teacher of both Tsars Alexander III and Nicholas II. An Aristotelian to his very soul, Pobyednostsev believed that the strength of Russia was in the Orthodox Church and that the strength of the Church was that it never changed. The continuation of the regime depends upon our ability to keep Russia in a frozen state, Pobyednostsev had said. The slightest warm breath of life would cause the whole thing to rot. Hostile to creative thinking was the way Witte characterized Pobyednostsev. Also on the right, next slide, were the union of the Russian people and the Black Hundreds, seen here in a demonstration of the Black Hundreds in St. Petersburg, a paramilitary, reactionary, anti-Semitic organization working closely with the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana. The Black Hundreds were also involved in 2 assassination attempts against Witte when he was appointed premier in 1906, murder attempts which were never seriously investigated by the Tsar's police. Okay, next slide. Next slide. We'll go on here. His opponents on the left may be a bit more well-known to members of the audience. Although this picture is from 1917, the cast of characters were pretty much the same. 1917 really being the continuation of the 1905 revolution, as the perpetrators themselves often have proclaimed. Lenin didn't quite make it to the 1905 revolution, but his colleague, Leon Trotsky, often not seen in this picture, is seen here on the steps. He was there. As the revolutionary cauldron boiled and bubbled, Witte, banished from his post by the Tsar, was called back to rally the nation. "I'm sure the only one who can help you now and be useful is Witte," the Tsar's mother wrote Nicholas. Somewhat reluctantly, the Tsar again called on the banished Witte. In the midst of a general strike in St. Petersburg led by Trotsky and his friends, Witte demanded that the Tsar either establish a dictatorship or institute a constitution. Finding no volunteers for dictator, including his uncle Nikolai Nikolaevich, who would lead the troops in World War I, he presented him with the possibility of becoming dictator, and Nikolai said, "Well, look, I will shoot if you insist that I become dictator, I will shoot myself here on the spot." So there were no takers. The Tsar agreed to a constitution, and Witte was assigned to write the document. The October Manifesto, as it came to be called, became the fundamental law of the land, at least temporarily. By that manifesto, the Empire of the Romanovs became a constitutional monarchy, and Witte the first constitutional premier. Although very limited in scope, the manifesto called for the formation of the first Duma, first parliament, which was given important legislative and budgetary functions. But the Tsar still remained in control of the executive, the armed forces, and foreign policy. Witte also succeeded in the general ferment in forcing the retirement of the aging Pobyednostsev, and freedom of religion in Russia was proclaimed. Agitation from the right and the left, both heavily financed from British coffers, kept the country on the verge of chaos in spite of Witte's measures. With his trickster's simple-mindedness, Trotsky said he hoped that the revolution would capitulate before his liberalism. When a British delegation, parliamentary delegation, came to give support to the radicals in the revolution, Nicholas wrote to his uncle Edward saying, "Can't you call it off?" Edward says, "No, I have no possibility of doing that." Nicholas lamented to his mother, "Uncle Bertie informed us that they were very sorry, but were unable to take action against their government." Uncle Bertie knew that the chaos he fomented in Russia would eliminate it as a European power and drive a desperate Nicholas into his waiting arms. But also the Tsar was really not prepared to allow autocratic rule to be called into question by any constitution. Nicholas called the period of Witte's premiership "my nightmare." But the nightmare for the Tsar was only beginning. In January 1906, the Tsar dismissed Witte's premier, saying, "As long as I live, I will never trust that man again with the smallest thing." Witte would meet the Tsar only twice more in the 9 years he had left to live. The Tsar had found new advisors, and I'll just go through these two guys quickly. And so on the others, right. Pyotr Stolypin, who would institute the land reform long recommended by Witte to the Tsar's deaf ear. Under Stolypin, a land reform was carried out, but it was combined with a brutal and violent political crackdown, which ultimately led to his own assassination in 1911. Another advisor was the evil mystic, the Raskolnik Rasputin, who made his way into the graces of Tsarina Alexandra, a serious foe to Witte during his entire period. Rasputin succeeded in establishing a psychosexual control over this hysterical woman. And I say psychosexual. There are rumors, very clear rumors, that he did have a relationship with her. The assumption is that Tsarina Alexandra, not being Russian herself, but loving the blood and soil of the Slavophile ideology, wanted to get as close to that soil as possible. And since Rasputin never took a bath, she figured starting an affair with him would do the trick. During the war, Rasputin would even advise on military operations, advice which the unstable ruler, to his sorrow, did in fact follow. From that point on, the pathetic Nicholas went from one blunder to another. In 1907, under pressure from the French ally and without Witte's presence to counter the Anglophilia of much of the Russian court, Nicholas signed a mutual defense treaty with Great Britain, bringing Russia into what was now the Triple Entente. Next picture, to the far right. On August 2nd, 1914, the Tsar issued a formal proclamation of hostilities at the Winter Palace. The Palace Square, one of the largest in Europe, was packed with thousands of sweltering, excited people carrying banners, flags, icons, and waiting impatiently for the moment when they could pour out their emotion in the presence of the sovereign. When Nicholas and Alexandra stepped onto the quay at the Palace Bridge, wave on wave of cheers rolled over them. "Batyushka, batyushka, little father, lead us to victory." Returning to St. Petersburg from abroad in 1914, Witte tried to stop the war. "The war is madness. Why should Russia fight? Our prestige in the Balkans, our pious duty to help our blood brothers, that is a romantic old-fashioned chimera. We must liquidate this stupid adventure as soon as possible." But by that point, the die had already been cast. The punctum saliens had come and gone. A new geometry had been formed, and there was no returning to the old. Within a year, Witte would be dead, allegedly of a stroke, but with strong suspicion that foul play had occurred. Leaving for the front in March 1915, Nicholas wrote his wife, "I am going with such a calm in my soul that I am myself surprised, whether it is because I had a talk with our friend, Rasputin, or because of the newspaper telling me of the death of Witte, I don't know." 2 years later, the same Tsar, His wife, his 4 children, seen here, would be shot to death by Bolshevik executioners. At the last minute, they tried to get asylum in England, but the new King George V refused. But it was the nation that was to suffer the most in the course of the bloody carnage of that great war. Total casualties: dead, 1,650,000, and more than 4 million wounded. All because of leaders who refused to see and institutions that refused to change. That's it.
Go ahead and bring up the transparency. We take you now to France. The year is 1870. The French military forces under the command of Emperor Napoleon III have just suffered a crushing, humiliating defeat in the hands of Germany. With the war barely a month old, the French army suffered its defeat at Sedan, and Emperor Napoleon, nephew of Bonaparte, was taken prisoner. Many years later, writing as a historian, Gabriel Hanotaux described Napoleon's role as a puppet on English strings. Napoleon, in insurrection against Europe, thought he would find a point of support in the English alliance. At the outset, she accompanied Napoleon in all his adventures, free to quit him when he was once deeply engaged. She knew how to stop him at the decisive moment and to snatch the fruits of victory from him when the due time came. At last, when the Franco-German War put the fate of Europe in suspense, England failed him once again. There he is. The Third Republic of France was the daughter of this crushing defeat. Once the Republic was proclaimed, all eyes turned toward the elder statesman Adolphe Thiers, who was voted chief executive of the new Republic. This was political irony, for Thiers had denounced those who wanted to go to war with Germany just months before, and he had been labeled a traitor and even had his house surrounded and threatened by angry Paris street mobs. Over and over again, these enragés mobs will be whipped up by France's historic enemies to destroy any efforts at the indispensable Franco-German rapprochement, without which there could be no peace in Europe. And you see here a typical cartoon of the day. The rather decrepit, disgusting-looking fellow on the left is supposed to be Thiers, who's dragging off France to be ravished by Germany. When these events were taking place, Gabriel Hanotaux, the future historian and foreign affairs minister, and a central figure in this story, was just 16 years old. But his future dedication to his nation was already evident. For the young Hanotaux, France's crushing defeat stirred no jingoistic passions against Germany, but rather a passion to learn, to reach out into past history to understand what had just happened. The generation to which I belong, Hanotaux wrote in later years, was barely emerging from childhood. Its intellect was matured by that cruel spectacle. From that time, pressing questions arose in me. What had been the causes of the greatness of France in the past? What had been the causes of her defeat? And what would be the moving forces of her approaching resurrection? Before we can answer that question posed by the young Hanotaux, we have to know something about French history. Because France became the first modern nation-state of Europe, a commonwealth, in the years following the Council of Florence. France's King Louis XI became the first true republican monarch, educated by an ally of the great Christian humanist Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. He ended the 100 Years' War and united the kingdom around the slogan, "One law, one weight, one currency." It also helped that he created one permanent army. In the years following the reign of Louis XI, the League of Cambrai almost vanquished Venice, and the history of Europe since that time has been an effort by Venetian-centered and later British-centered efforts to crush the French nation-state because of what it represented. The living example of the republican or commonwealth form of government, which based itself on uplifting the population, bringing science, technology, and cathedral building and art into the daily lives of the people, thus enabling them to contribute to the advancement of the nation. The great figures who shaped France include names some of you will be familiar with: King Henry IV, the economist Jean Bodin, whose political, economic, and religious manifesto was his motto, "There is no wealth but man." The great Cardinal Richelieu and the Oratorian School, and most important, Louis XIV's chief minister, Colbert, who founded the French Academy of Sciences in collaboration with Leibniz and promoted an era of economic development unprecedented in France. These were the men who laid the foundations for the École Polytechnique in the late 18th century and its successors, which included the West Point Academy in America. These men and their lives were passionately studied by our young friend, Hanotaux. He read and studied Jean Bodin. He read Machiavelli's The Prince, which was written about Louis XI. He read Plato and Erasmus. He wanted to know everything about Cardinal Richelieu and about Louis XIV's reign. He threw himself into these studies with such abandon that he would later write, "I lived in the 17th century before I lived in my times." Hanotaux's first published article when he was 24 years old was entitled, "Did the Venetians Betray Christianity in 1202?" and shows that he was on the path to studying the critical issues and conflicts that shaped Western civilization. Hanotaux wrote articles calling for a resurrection of Henry IV's policy of religious toleration, the famous Edict of Nantes, which allowed Catholics and Protestants to live side by side, and for a return to Cardinal Richelieu's European foreign policy. When Hanotaux finally joined the French Foreign Affairs Ministry in 1885, it wasn't to make a smart career move. He was already a recognized historian. It was to bring these great ideas from his nation's past to bear in future foreign policy. Throughout the 1880s and 90s, France was polarized politically and socially around two major issues: to collaborate with Germany in building the peace, or to wage a war of revenge. And secondly, to bring about collaboration of Catholics in building the new republic, or to wage the Freemasonry's war on religion. The underlying problem was that while the Catholic Church in France was a wellspring of the ideas of the Christian Renaissance and the Republic, the Catholic hierarchy was intimately tied to feudal structures of the past and was a manipulated tool, by and large, of the Venetian party in France. The hierarchy and clergy were not only favoring a return to feudal or monarchical forms of government, they were also in open insurrection against their own great pope, Leo XIII. And I'll just show you here an example of the Freemasonic propaganda against the church. This is a magazine cover in which you see the church represented by this vampire-like creature crouching over France, and the slogan, "Voilà l'ennemi," here is the enemy. These were the fault lines along which France was divided, and which ultimately allowed the oligarchical faction's triumph in 1898. The defining moment of that triumph was the collapse of Hanotaux's cabinet and the ascendancy of Théophile Delcassé. The religious question colored every aspect of political and intellectual life in France. Hanotaux himself, raised in a Catholic family, reports that he was, as a youth, influenced by the atheistic sarcasm and cynicism of Voltaire. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Hanotaux's passionate commitment to discovering the secrets of France's greatness led him to overcome that cynical outlook. In later years, Hanotaux would compare Voltaire's activities in the city of Orléans to the English siege of that city in the early 15th century. That siege was broken by the heroine of France, Joan of Arc. Hanotaux further characterized Voltaire's writings as, quote, "horrid blasphemy inspired by rancid malice from the other side of the Channel." He described Voltaire's book about Joan of Arc as a piece of trash. It was typical of Hanotaux that he would rescue Joan of Arc from the depredations of Voltaire with nothing less than his own 5-volume study, which laid the groundwork for her eventual canonization. Why was it so important for France's enemies, now centered in the Venetian party transplanted into England, to provoke religious wars in France in the 19th century? And why express an ongoing desire to seek another Franco-Prussian war, as Lord Salisbury did in 1887? As you have seen and heard from the previous presentations, the British were potentially in big trouble as a result of large-scale development projects being initiated on the Eurasian continent and elsewhere. Just before the Franco-Prussian War, the French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps had completed his project to open the Suez Canal in Egypt, a project earlier proposed to Louis XIV by Leibniz, and which was completed only despite years of maniacal opposition by Britain's Lord Palmerston. And now de Lesseps was at it again. In 1873, he presented a paper to the French Academy of Sciences calling for a Eurasian rail project, which I think some of you will instantly recognize. What I've done here is taken a map published in EIR showing the Eurasian land bridge development project of LaRouche, and I've traced in red de Lesseps's proposed Asiatic Grand Central, as described by Hanotaux. Starting from Orenburg on the River Ural, this railroad would have gone as far as Peshawar on the Indian frontier, joining the Russian system to the Anglo-Indian system of railways across Central Asia. It would have been a communication between the Trans-Siberian on the one hand and the Baghdad Railway on the other. The object was to join the European railways with the Indian railways and beyond with future Chinese railways. This type of spectacular project, combined with policies to end the feudal oligarchical systems of government in Europe, could have been the basis for real peace on the continent. But the projects went further into Africa as well. After some years serving in the cabinets of Léon Gambetta and Jules Ferry, Hanotaux was in the Foreign Ministry as Director of Protectorates in 1889. He wrote up a memo for his minister describing a project to build a canal that would connect the Nile River in the east to the Congo River system, the Ubangi tributary in the west. While I don't have a copy of that memo, I do have a speech by Hanotaux in 1902, in which he described his vision for the future of Africa, which is absolutely antithetical to the British model. Now, when Hanotaux first gave that speech, he writes later on that it was accompanied by maps, and we don't have those maps right now, but I've taken the liberty of showing what I think his maps would have looked like. In red, you have his projected railways. The green lines will be his canals, and the orange circles are his broad development zones. And you see here a map of existing rail lines in Africa, and you can see to what extent what was proposed 100 years ago just we haven't even scratched the surface of it. And now from his speech. The railroad shall be the true conqueror of Africa. The railroad traverses deserts. It crosses over waterfalls. It thus opens up to commerce the vast area of the interior plateau and access to the Great Lakes, which shall see powerful civilizations established on their shores. The day when science will have effectively routed malaria, one of the greatest benefits which can be spread across the planet by human genius, will have been achieved. Half of the African continent will be given back to life. Deep forests will be pierced, and immense regions will once again see divine light. The swamps will be drained, and the flow of water facilitated. Where water is lacking, it will be captured. The problem of the desert will be taken on. The harnessing of waterfalls will soon furnish African industry with inexhaustible energy resources. Near the waterfalls, we shall see powerful factories being erected, borrowing from the very river the force necessary for the exploitation of its prodigious resources. Can we not see advancing from the coast towards the interior, through a universal effort, the lines of railroads which shall soon transform the economic life of the entire continent? Is not a global program to methodically trace a transcontinental railroad, utilizing the great rivers, uniting the Nile and the Congo rivers, the Benue and the Sangha rivers, through a vast system of canals, supporting the development of the river networks through the development of the railroads, and thus turning the interior of Africa into an immense buzzing hive where trains and steamships capable of devouring distances will rush towards an immense depot in which the people and merchandise of the universe will converge. Is this not the most obvious and imminent of possibilities? Then populations will multiply, manpower will increase. European penetration has encountered that great and ancient belief of Islam, which here, more than anywhere else, is full of vitality. This religion proclaims the existence of a single God, attaches to faith in this God all individual and social virtues. We owe Islam toleration, but toleration is not enough. We owe it understanding. We owe it even more. We owe it respect. New African civilizations around lakes, factories in Africa powered by hydroenergy, railroads and canals bringing development into the interior of the continent, populations multiplying, all of this was not what the British had in mind for Africa. Hanotaux worked closely with his mentor, Prime Minister Jules Ferry, to establish a colonizing policy for Africa based on these principles. He collaborated closely with Pope Leo XIII's loyal friend, Cardinal Lavigerie, in building the Cathedral of St. Louis in Carthage, an effort to sustain the Catholic Church in Africa. Eventually, Hanotaux was promoted to the rank of foreign minister in 1894 by President Sadi Carnot, grandson of the great Lazare Carnot. The signs of British restlessness with France were becoming evident. Both of Hanoteu's mentors were soon to be assassinated. Ferry had been shot in 1887 by a so-called religious fanatic and died from those wounds 6 years later. President Carnot was shot 2 months after Hanoteu became foreign minister, this time by an Italian anarchist. In short, the same networks used to assassinate President McKinley. As foreign minister, Hanoteu pursued a threefold policy. 1. Strengthening the Franco-Russian alliance begun by President Carnot. 2. Continuing the policy of détente with Germany. And 3. Orchestrating a series of international agreements to consolidate the French position in Africa around Lake Chad and to prevent the British from seizing the entire eastern side of Africa from the Cape to Cairo. Already the British had succeeded in stealing the shares of the Suez Canal owned by Egypt, so that the canal they had so long opposed was now under their control. It was in the midst of some of Hanoteu's most delicate and intensive negotiations aimed at preventing the British from consolidating their position over the entire Nile Valley that the infamous Dreyfus affair was unleashed, and sectarian passions once again stalked the French political landscape. Minister of War General Mercier briefed a secret cabinet meeting on his alleged discovery of a spy for Germany within the French military, and of his intention to open a prosecution of that alleged spy, Captain Dreyfus. One lone voice was heard in opposition. Like Thiers speaking out in opposition to Napoleon's decision to go to war with Germany, Hanoteu stood up and insisted that the so-called evidence was so weak that, quote, I am opposed to any legal action or even to any investigation, warning that this could lead to the gravest of international difficulties, a diplomatic rupture with Germany, even war. When this intervention failed, he went privately to see General Mercier, a committed revanchist, and warned him, public passions are not released with impunity. As you know, Captain Dreyfus was Jewish, and there was no better combination to whip up public passions in France at the turn of the century than to come up with a German spy who was also a Jew. Captain Dreyfus was tried in a rocket docket worthy of Albert V. Bryan of Alexandria, Virginia, complete with withholding of exculpatory evidence and outright forgeries. Shipped off to the brutal conditions of the penal colony on Devil's Island, Dreyfus, his family, and a small group of supporters proclaimed his innocence. His case polarized France as nothing else had, amplifying the divisions we spoke of earlier. The central players in this drama and their alliances were as bizarre as any on the European continent. Édouard Drumont, editor of the anti-Semitic, Jesuit-financed newspaper La Libre Parole, whose main readership consisted of a combination of small village priests and former members of the Paris Commune. The League of Patriots, the chief organization that had backed the revanchist insurrection of General Boulanger against President Carnot's regime. Fortunately for France, General Boulanger was unable to climb off his mistress long enough to mount his black horse and lead the charge against the Republic. The leftist radicals of the Georges Clemenceau variety, who were as deeply committed to war with Germany as the right wing, these were the networks of the Grand Orient Freemasonic Lodge of France, whose goals included the establishment of a diplomatic alliance with Britain, an end to the Africa policy of Ferry and Hanoteu, and the purging of the country of Catholic and religious interests. In the middle of this snake pit, Hanoteu and his faction of anti-Voltaire Republicans, many of them non-Catholics and some of them even Freemasons, sought a policy of cooperation with Pope Leo XIII and what few allies he had in the Catholic Church in France. Chief among those allies was the great Cardinal Lavigerie, head of the Catholic diocese in Africa. Lavigerie worked feverishly to abolish slavery and to save souls. Time and time again, Pope Leo XIII ordered the French cardinals, in letters and encyclicals, to abandon their allegiance to the monarchy and declare their loyalty to the Republic, and they refused. Only Cardinal Lavigerie would do it, and in 1890 he gave his famous speech announcing that he, until then a confirmed royalist, would declare his allegiance to the Republic in order to, quote, wrench the country back from the abyss which threatens it. The Dreyfus affair amplified the already chronic instability of the Third Republic. The Prime Minister and his cabinet depended day to day on the vagaries of a parliamentary majority. After 2 years as foreign minister, the cabinet in which Hanoteu served was brought down, and a radical Republican or Freemasonic cabinet was formed. It was in that cabinet that the approval was given for the mission of Captain Marchand to cross Africa from the west and reach Fashoda on the Nile. After a 6-month hiatus, Hanotaux returned to the Quai d'Orsay in a new cabinet and immediately preoccupied himself with the impending events on the Nile. During the months that Captain Marchand was trekking through the jungles and swamps to reach Fashoda, Hanotaux continued his efforts to reach an understanding with Germany on the question. Now, the Marchand expedition itself was a prescription for disaster. Months before the Marchand expedition was approved, Hanotaux had negotiated a treaty with England which limited Egypt's possessions over the Nile to Khartoum, thereby achieving diplomatically the goal of limiting English influence in the region. But the French cabinet had refused to ratify this agreement, almost provoking Hanotaux's resignation. The subsequent folly of sending Captain Marchand on a military expedition to plant a French flag at Fashoda was the pet project of Théophile Delcassé and the Colonial Party. Hanotaux had opposed it when first proposed to him by Captain Marchand himself in June of 1895, and he could have recalled it, and it was perhaps his fatal mistake that he didn't. In contrast to the folly of the Marchand expedition, Hanotaux's successful diplomacy was built on a commitment to an entente with Germany. In early 1896, the records show the fruit of that effort, when Jurin, Foreign Secretary, spoke to the French ambassador in Berlin about, quote, limiting the insatiable appetite of England, adding, it is necessary to show England that she can no longer take advantage of the Franco-German antagonism to seize whatever she wants. At that very moment, England was, in fact, planning to seize Sudan, where a nationalist rebellion some 10 years earlier had freed it of Egyptian and British control. The drama in Africa dragged on for 2 years, and finally, in June of '98, just weeks before Marchand arrived at Fashoda, Hanotaux received what he had been waiting for, a message from the German ambassador suggesting broad collaboration on a number of issues, particularly with respect to England. Hanotaux immediately wrote a note to his ambassador in Cairo, suggesting that settlement of the so-called Egyptian question might be at hand as a result of German support. 9 days later, Hanotaux's cabinet was brought down by a combination of left radicals and extreme right-wingers. Hanotaux left the foreign ministry never to return, and the first act of his successor, Delcassé, was to turn his back on the alliance with Germany. In July, Marchand arrived at Fashoda and hoisted his flag. But before the news of Marchand's arrival reached France from Africa, Sirdar Kitchener carried out a horrible massacre, killing thousands in the Battle of Omdurman on September the 2nd, 1898. And this is basically a map of that battle. Having received intelligence reports of a French presence, he then continued south to meet Marchand and ordered him to remove the French flag and depart. Marchand answered that his orders came only from the French government. And this is Kitchener up on a British warship, and the small rowboat contains Marchand and his men and the French flag. But the French government was at that moment paralyzed by a succession of crises. A national strike, which some accused of London banks of financing, new outbreaks of Dreyfus-related scandals, and another cabinet collapse. As news reached both capitals of the Marchand-Kitchener encounter, the British Navy was mobilized, and Minister of Colonies Chamberlain pressed for an immediate preventive war with France. Finally, on November 3rd, Delcassé ordered Marchand to retreat in utter humiliation. In the period after this strategic humiliation of France, Delcassé and his backers in the Colonial Party agreed to a convention with England which excluded France from the entirety of the Nile Valley. In return, she received British support for the French claim over Morocco. This 1899 convention contained the seeds of the disastrous 1904 Entente Cordiale between France and England, which inexorably drew France into the web of Edward VII and his march toward the hecatomb of World War I. When the Entente Cordiale's provisions were made public, finally in 1911, they were denounced by Hanotaux. Quote, France has not chosen the directions of her foreign policy, but was submitted to them. Did not act, but was acted upon. The Entente was a marvelous invention of English diplomatic genius, created to divide her adversaries, creating an area of friction between France and Germany, with Morocco as the piece of bait. Morocco was for the British nothing more than a difficult-to-manage piece of real estate, and it was the perfect bone of contention as Hanoteau called it, to set up renewed animosities between France and Germany. Those animosities flared twice to the brink of war in 1905 and 1911, when Germany insisted on pressing its claim over Morocco. As the rope is to the hanged man, King Edward was always there to provide his support for France in these crises with Germany. In the final years before World War I, Delcasse pursued his goal of an alliance between France, England, and Russia against Germany, the hostile encirclement policy that hastened events down the path towards this apocalyptic war. As the war approached, Hanoteau commented, "These times are as tragic as those that inspired Shakespeare." The casualties resulting from this capitulation of France were enormous: 1.5 million dead, 3 million wounded. But it would be a mistake to think that only Europeans went to the slaughter. As a result of the overthrow of Hanoteau and his collaborators, the door was opened in Africa to the most savage looting and genocide. Much of France's fear in Africa had been peacefully won over in the 1880s by the French explorer Servagnan de Brazza, who told African slaves they had only to touch the French flag in order to be emancipated. As Commissioner General of the French Congo, he steadfastly opposed the efforts of French companies linked to London-centered banking interests, the privateers of the day, and their schemes to loot and pillage. Following a slanderous campaign against him, Brazza was recalled to France in 1898. Foreign Minister Théophile Delcasse wrote the original decree allowing private charter companies to be given absolute monopolistic control over most of the equatorial region of Africa. This meant that slavery had been abolished in name only. In addition, French colonial policy in Africa became dominated by the idea of building an indigenous conscript army. Under this policy, tens of thousands of able-bodied African men had to be provided each year as trainees to become cannon fodder for the impending war effort against Germany. The result was that by 1921, the African population of the French Congo had been reduced by nearly half, from 4.8 to 2.8 million people. The introduction and triumph of British methods, policies, and programs over the Republican ideal in France had tragic consequences which afflict many portions of the world to this day.
Of that development policy, seems to be disappearing here, was Sergei Yulievich Witte, who for 11 years until his dismissal in 1903 would serve as the Russian Minister of Finance. During these years, the Russian economy would experience a spurt in the rate of growth hitherto unknown in that country. An unusual figure, Witte was a member of the lower nobility born in Tbilisi in present-day Georgia. In his earlier career, including a shorter stint as Minister of Ways and Communications, Witte had the opportunity of formulating railway policy, including the centerpiece of the Russian program, the Trans-Siberian Railway. When he became finance minister, he had the means of realizing that program. Next slide. Okay. Witte reformed the entire state of Russian finances, stabilizing the widely fluctuating ruble by pegging it to gold. He also converted high-interest rate domestic loans into low-interest rate loans taken out abroad. Although Russia would have to borrow heavily during the coming 10 years in order to finance this massive railroad construction, the annual debt service grew only slightly. Witte transformed the finance ministry into a regular chancellery of the realm, with extensive intelligence networks in all the major political and financial capitals of the world. His aim was to transform Russia from a backward peasant country into a major industrial power. As he expressed it in his annual report to the Tsar in 1899, we must give the country such industrial perfection as has been reached by the United States of America. In realizing this goal, Witte had some extremely able assistance from renowned Russian chemist Dmitry Ivanovich Mendeleev, better known to all students of chemistry as the discoverer of the periodic table. Here we see one of the original attempts at the periodic table by Mendeleev with some of the elements already missing. Mendeleev discovered the lawfulness of the construction would provide the basis for the important collaboration between Witte and French Foreign Minister Gabriel Hanotaux, which would represent perhaps the greatest single challenge to the British colonial empire during that century. The collaboration also provided Witte with access to the needed capital to begin his great railroad construction. Next slide. For Witte, the most important educational program was that provided by a flourishing industry. Here you see them laying track or beginning to clear the road for the railroad. With the first investment in industry, Witte said, the powerful stimulus of personal interest calls forth such curiosity and love of learning as to make an illiterate peasant into a railway builder, a bold and progressive organizer of industry, and a versatile financier. Next slide. The Trans-Siberian Railroad would become the longest railroad in the world and still remains so today. But it was only the most important part of an extensive Russian network built during this period, as viewed in the next overhead in this foreign ministry map from 1900. You see, especially, if you can see it clearly, it's not a very good map, but up in the western part of Russia, there is an extensive network of rails. As you come down into Siberia, there is only the one single line, which was the case for a long period of time. For Witte, as for Friedrich List, railroads were much more than a mere means of transportation. As Witte himself would later write, the railroad exerts a civilizing influence as a theoretical and practical school where it does not so much adjust itself to the local conditions, but rather where the local conditions adjust themselves to the needs of the railroad. The railroad is, as it were, a seed bed which produces a cultural flowering within the population. And even if it meets on its route an absolutely barbarous people, it will in short time raise them to the necessary level of culture. And for Russia, this was a crying necessity, as the level of culture for the broad masses of people was absolutely abysmal, as we see in this picture from the famine that hit the country in 1891. And the railroad was built. Looking over to the chart here, you can see how many miles of rail per year were laid between 1890 and 1900, roughly the period where Witte was in charge of the finance ministry. Prior to the previous decade, that is between 1879 and 1892, there had been built 5,466 miles of new rails or opened up in Russia. In contrast to that, between 1892 and 1901, there had been constructed 14,814 miles of new rail, nearly triple the amount previous, a more rapid rate of railroad construction than any other country known except the United States. But the Trans-Siberian was more than simply a quick means of travel through the vast Siberian spaces. It was what Lyndon LaRouche would characterize as the land bridge to Asia. Traveling between London and Shanghai during that period, as we can see on the map, London on the one extreme and Shanghai on the other, would take a traveler by ship 34 to 36 days at a cost of 450 rubles. When the Trans-Siberian was completed, the same traveler could arrive in Shanghai from London in 16 days at a cost of 200 rubles for the same ticket. The overland journey would be twice as fast and 2.5 times cheaper. And indeed, people did travel. There was an immigration, a planned immigration of opening up land for people who didn't have it in the Siberian spaces. People took that opportunity. Nearly 160,000 per year traveled on that Trans-Siberia to a new home in Siberia. By 1990,
Okay, William Jones is next on Witte.
It's the wrong ones. He comes later. We'll leave the bad news until last. There you go. To the casual observer of the international political scene in 1870, the close relations then existing between autocratic Russia and the American Republic might seem rather puzzling. On closer examination, however, one could detect amazing similarities between these two very disparate nations. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II liberated the serfs of Russia, affecting the status of 52 million peasants, 22 million of them serfs. 2 years later, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln, by the Emancipation Proclamation, liberated 4 million slaves in the United States. During that same Civil War, Tsar Alexander sent a Russian fleet to the United States as a signal to the British that were they to enter the war on the side of the Confederacy, so would Russia enter on the side of the Union. The secret orders contained by the Russian commander said, in the event of war, you are to fire upon the commerce of the enemy, that is, on the British. With the decree of 1861 liberating the serfs, Russia took the first faltering steps on the road to economic and political reform. First slide here. Can we get it, maybe the lights down a little bit, and so that people can see this? I don't know if it's better. Okay. Focus a little bit too, also. Yeah. From 1892, the prime architect of the elements, but that didn't mean that he knew where all the elements were. He just knew approximately where they would be, and it was later on that they would be discovered. This is an early attempt at putting that together. Mendeleev had already been appointed by Witt's predecessor, director of the Bureau of Weights and Standards, from which post he introduced the metric system into Russia, thus bringing the Russian system up to international standards. In 1899, Mendeleev, on behalf of the Ministry of Finance, led a group of scientists through the Ural Mountains in Siberia to examine the mineral deposits available, on the basis of which Russia could develop her own iron industry, a prerequisite for railroad building. Next slide. Mendeleev also helped develop the world's first icebreaker, shown here in the picture, the Ermak. Mendeleev and Witte were both followers of the economic theories of German-American economist Friedrich List, a strong proponent of a system of protective tariffs for industrially backward countries, behind which they would be able to develop their own infant industries, safe from the cheaper products from more developed countries. The free market theories of British intelligence agent Adam Smith, touted so loudly these days by the friends of Newt Gingrich's conservative revolution, were specifically developed by Smith in the late 1700s in order to bamboozle the young American Republic into remaining a mere producer of agricultural goods. Fortunately for us, Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, didn't fall for these tricks. In 1894, the Ministry of Finance also took charge of all commercial and technical schools in Russia, opening up over 100 new schools during the following decade. In 1891, Russia, under the Tsar Alexander III, the son of the Tsar Liberator, who had been assassinated in 1881, had made important moves toward establishing new relations with Republican France, thus opening up the French capital markets for Russian loans. In 1894, this relationship